We have a lot to celebrate this weekend. We are celebrating the Feast of All Saints, so we celebrate all of the saints who have gone before us and our own membership in the communion of saints. And in the United States, we have an extra celebration, to something else to celebrate to go along with this. Anyone here from the Knights of Columbus probably already knows what I'm talking about, because today, October 31st, 2020, the founder of the Knights of Columbus, Father Michael McGivney, was beatified in Hartford, Connecticut. So what does that mean? Well, beatification is the final step before being declared by the Church to be a member of the communion of saints. So it's something great for us to celebrate this weekend, along with our celebration of all the saints. And why is this so important to us? Why is this so important for us to celebrate the lives of the saints? And when we look at sainthood, it's not just something that is important to us, it is the most important thing in our lives. Because this is why we were placed on this earth. God created us and placed us here so that we could know Him and love Him and find our way back to Him for eternity. It doesn't mean that we'll all be canonized and have our names sung in the litany, because that's not really what sainthood is about. But it's about being in heaven for eternity with Christ. So there's a question we always ask when we talk about this. How do we achieve this? How do we become saints in our lives? If it is this important, then isn't this something that we should all understand? We should all know how to accomplish this in our lives. And there's many things we can do to try and to define sainthood and answer that great question, and there's many different answers that people could give. But the truth is, we really don't need to answer that question, because Christ has already answered it for us. When we hear in this reading him talking about the Beatitudes, he's teaching us the path to sainthood. He's teaching us what it means to be blessed. A formal blessing is a divine act from God on our lives, sometimes conferred through an intermediary like a priest or a deacon. But what Jesus is teaching is that by following these examples, by following these teachings of His, we bring God's blessing directly into our lives. Some of the things that he's saying have an origin in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Psalms and in the wisdom tradition. And in these earlier writings, blessed also means happy. So what he's doing is setting an example for us that will not only bring God's blessing upon our lives, but will bring great joy into our lives as well. How does that happen? When he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, blessed are the humble." When we hear him say the poor in spirit, it's often interpreted as the poor, those who live as beggars in the street, who have nothing. But in this earlier Hebrew writing, it meant the people who realized that their greatest joy would be found in the kingdom of heaven and not in anything on this earth. Blessed are they who seek the kingdom of heaven rather than the things of this world. He said, blessed are they who mourn. Doesn't that seem like a paradox? How does mourning bring joy into our lives? Why would we seek to mourn in our lives? Well, he doesn't really say that we should seek to be mourning, but there are times when we should. We should mourn some of the things that we see in this world, especially when God's plan is not realized in our world. That is definitely something that we should be mourning. And it's something that leads us to that blessedness. These are some of the examples of what Christ was teaching, but they all have a common theme and a lesson in them. In following these examples that he sets for us, it calls us to live in a way that many people would not choose. It's certainly not what the world teaches us, to live in this way. We're living very contrary to the world. Who says, I want to be poor in spirit, I want to be meek, humble, I want to mourn? Nobody seeks these things, but look at the example of Christ's life. He was poor, he was meek and humble. And we often hear stories of him mourning those who could not realize that the kingdom of heaven had come into our world and was being offered to them. Many people who challenge our faith look at these examples and say that's a pathetic way to live. But Christ's life was anything but pathetic. It was beautiful and an example for all of us. And we celebrate in the saints how we continue to see that example carried on and passed on to us. What was it that led St. Francis of Assisi to renounce all of his worldly possessions and live as a beggar serving the poor? It's the same thing that inspired our Pope to take his name and continue to teach that example to the world. I look at people like St. Damien of Molokai, say, what inspired him to leave behind everything that he knew in this world and go live in a leper colony on an island in Hawaii so he could minister to the people who had been forgotten and abandoned by the world until he eventually died of the disease himself? It's the same thing that inspires all the saints. It's the love of Christ and the desire to bring that love to the world. Now, I talked about how we don't need to try and define sainthood because Christ has done that for us. In fact, if we try to define it ourselves, it's not likely that we will find it. Because the world teaches us so much about what will bring joy and contentment into our lives, but this is so far away from what Christ has already taught us. Out of all of the things that we could seek for ourselves in this world, what could be better than what Christ himself has already shown us? Now, when we celebrate this weekend the lives of the saints and everything that the saints have done, it's also an opportunity to celebrate our own call to sainthood. Because we all have that calling. We all have a vocation. We all have a calling. Each one of us was created with our own path to sainthood. That means before any of us were born, God imagined a path to holiness for each one of us. A path for each one of us to become what we were created. So as we pray for the saints, and as we pray for their intercession for us, we can also pray for ourselves and our vocation. That God will give each of us the wisdom to know the path that he has laid out for us and the courage to follow him on that path. And it may appear to be the least desirable path to walk. As Christ himself, as we hear him saying, it could be the path where others will persecute and insult and utter every evil against us because we walk that path. But it's the path that leads us to Christ. And because of that, it's the path that leads to the greatest joy, the greatest peace that any of us could ever know, the joy of sainthood.